Dear all, warm welcome from the European Women Office here in Brussels at the EU quarter. Thank you very much for joining us for another edition of Talking Europe. Our regular conversations with senior figures from the European institutions and the European Commission in particular, where we touch upon the work of the EU in different areas. And today we're particularly glad that we have the opportunity to host Wolfgang Burtscher, who is the Director General of the European Commission's DG Agriculture and Rural Development, to discuss about the Green Deal, to discuss about some of the EU's policies in the agricultural sector, and of course everything else that affect what we consume and what we eat. Wolfgang, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. It's quite prevalent that we're having this conversation with you. And the first thing I wanted to start with is perhaps to touch a little bit on how COVID and the health pandemic we are currently facing is affecting the agri-food sector. Unfortunately, the past few months have seen a very negative effect in everything, from the economy, social relationships, and of course, we couldn't avoid having that effect on the agricultural sector too. So could you take us through a little bit on your experience? What is the effect on the agri-food sector?
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Indeed, the European agriculture has quite some challenging months behind. And I think we have succeeded one thing. We have succeeded, and our farmers, retailers, and the food processors have been very active in this sense, that we have succeeded that the health crisis did not become a food crisis. But this does not mean that it was challenging for the farming sector. There have been quite some sectors, in particular in the HoReCa domain, which suffered from a decrease in demand from the side of our consumers. So there were certain sectors who came quite out of the crisis relatively well, like fruit and vegetables, but there are other sectors like flowers, like wine, partly also the beef sector and the dairy sector and other sectors who have really suffered from this demand. But I think what our farmers and our retailers and food processors have succeeded, that is the fact that our shops, our shelves are still full with excellent and high quality food. And that is not self-evident, I think.
Indeed. The response of the sector has been impressive, both at the production end of the line, but also at the supply end of the line, where at times when it was crucial for people to have access to food, the sector was there and it delivered. But I think that didn't happen without the support of the European Union and the European Commission in particular. The EU has been quite instrumental in helping the continent get over this crisis. So I'm curious to hear how exactly has the Commission helped the agri-food sector deal with the consequences of the pandemic crisis?
Thanks, Petros, for this question. Indeed, when the crisis started, we had faced quite some issues, and I think the European Commission, together with the member states, have acted very quickly. There were, first and foremost, at the beginning of crisis, quite some issues at the borders. Transport of food across borders was not so easy. There were restrictions for the transport sector, but also for drivers. And I think the European Commission very quickly issued guidelines to have so-called green lanes, which permitted that our food supply could cross borders without difficulties. Then a second thing, I think, which the Commission quickly acted upon was to provide flexibility for member states to provide state aid to the farming community. As the crisis was covering almost all sectors, I think this was very important to permit member states who were in certain areas particularly hit by the crisis, farmers were particularly hit by the crisis, member states could provide very quickly state aid. Another element on which we put a lot of focus in the fight against the crisis, and our Commissioner Wojciechowski was really insisting, was to simplify the life of the farmers. In what sense? Firstly, we have ensured that the rules for advancing farm payments, direct payments, were made available so we could advance payments. And we have also simplified rules relating to the control of the farmers before they are getting the money. So we have really simplified, I think, their life. Finally, the European Commission has also adopted specific market measures in those sectors and areas where farmers were particularly hit. And you have certainly heard about the fact that in certain areas like dairy, cheese, beef, and other sectors, European Commission is supporting farmers and their organizations that they can get reimbursed the costs for storage of goods which they could not sell because of the decrease of the demand. So we provide public support, if you so want, for private storage measures, and we have in addition taken other measures. Finally, and as a last point, our commissioner has also insisted that there is a tool to compensate farmers who have suffered specifically from the corona crisis, and in particular in the so-called second pillar of our common agricultural policy in rural development, we have made available quite a lot of funds so that they could be used to compensate farmers for their losses. Overall, I think what we sometimes oversee a little bit when it's coming to our crisis tools in the common agricultural policy is the following. Often people compare in times of crisis, for example, how much the United States spent for the crisis management. But I think that's not entirely fair, because I think what makes our big advantage, and which was one of the key core elements for our resilience, was the fact that we pay direct payments to our farmers, which is a kind of security net for the farming community. And these direct payments, they provide a kind of income in despite of the crisis. And I think that is very important if we want to have agriculture across the continent.
Absolutely. And this crisis has been a stark reminder of how important it is to work together to overcome challenges that would have been difficult to deal with if we were doing alone. But it has also reminded us the importance of food security and certainly food resilience. I would be interested to hear your thoughts about how those two things, food security and food resilience, have gained in importance after the COVID crisis in the overall discussion around agricultural policy in Europe.
Petros, I think at least what I really hope is that people realize that it is not self-evident to have full shelves in our supermarkets. This is not self-evident. It requires that we have farmers across the continent, all over the place, evidently that we have also food processors and retailers. So the value chain, starting with the primary production, is very important. And I think here, the objectives of the common agricultural policy, as they were laid down in the 60 years ago, they are still valid. It's about providing sufficient food, high quality food for our citizens at affordable prices. And I think thanks to the instruments which we have created in the context of the common agricultural policy, this basic element for resilience, which is that we have farmers, physically farmers, farming is taking place in Europe, but food production is taking place in Europe. This is at the core of why we were successful in ensuring resilience. But this does not mean that everything is perfect, and I think we have evidently seen some bottlenecks. I've already indicated there is the issue of the border crossing. There were issues with seasonal workers, in particular also in processing industry. So there are issues, and I think there is a particular point that came to the people to became conscious, which was also the importance of short circuits for food. And I think a discussion arose in this context. What kind of governance do we need in terms of trade in food? Do we need to rely on regional value chains? Do we need national value chains? Is the European single market the right thing? Do we also need international trade? And I think the truth is in food in order to ensure food security, because resilience we will not have if we have to entirely import our food production. I think everybody will understand. At the same time, purely relying on regional value chains will also not make it. So I think our challenge, and we have all to work together on this issue, is to find the right balance in this respect.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there, because we have had the structures in place for a long time in the form of the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, but also the internal market that facilitates free movement of goods. And we have been able to deal with the crisis much more effectively than we would have otherwise. And perhaps I think it's exactly the challenge that makes us realize that if things aren't working smoothly, if the internal market isn't allowed to perform like it's supposed to, we all lose out as a result. Now, in the course of the past few months, the Commission has come forward with very interesting proposals on the farm-to-fork strategy, for example, and of course, biodiversity strategy. And I wanted to inquire a little bit how those targets are relevant for the agri-food sector and how can they help the agriculture across Europe.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important topic. I told you about the objectives of the treaty regarding agriculture to provide food, sufficient food at high quality at affordable prices to ensure income for farmers. But I think one of the key important and core elements which agricultural activity has also to deliver is to green the common agricultural policy to make it more sustainable in ecological terms, but evidently also in economic and in social terms. So I think as you have seen, the European Green Deal and the related strategies, the biodiversity strategy, and the food farm-to-fork strategy have as an objective to provide a new growth strategy that ensures competitive, climate-neutral, resource-intensive economy. And evidently, that is also true for the food production. I think what is important in the farm-to-fork strategy and also partly to the biodiversity strategy, evidently, the farming community and the common agricultural policy has also to contribute to these objectives. But the farm-to-fork strategy, you have seen, provides a very holistic approach by arguing that it does not only require the primary production to adhere to the objectives of more ecological sustainability, but this is a task also for the processing industry, for the retailers, and finally for the farmers, for the consumers. So what is the impact of this discussion on the farming community? Evidently, and I think the feedback that we have seen when the European Commission has published the farm-to-fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, there were quite some concerns from the farmer side that the objectives, the targets set in these in these communications, in these policy documents, were very ambitious. And I think the farming community and the farm sector and the agriculture sector made it very clear that they are ready to contribute to these overarching objectives. But for them, it was still necessary to discuss the targets and the speed by when these targets have to be achieved. But I think broadly, there is a big buy-in also of the farming community to deliver on the green objectives. And why is this so important also for the farming community? Because firstly, the farming community is certainly one of those sectors that is most suffering from climate change. You have certainly heard, for example, this year that the harvests in Romania, because of droughts, are reduced by 30%, if my memory serves me well. So I think it's in the genuine interest of the farmers that we adjust and mitigate climate change. On the other hand, changing consumer behavior, in particular amongst young people, and I think they have to factor in these elements in the production of agricultural products. Finally, I think that it's for these new Green Deal initiatives also provide opportunities for new business models, for new incomes for the farmers. Just think about the discussion on carbon sequestration and farmers and foresters be remunerated for these specific tasks. So I think, again, there is broad buy-in also from the farming community to adhere to the objectives of the Green Deal and the related strategies.
Indeed, indeed. And like you said, the farming sector is one side of the economy that is closest to the environment, and it's imperative that we keep both in mind when deciding policy. Now, the common agricultural policy, like many other things at the European level, is in constant state of reform and improvement. We've seen it go through several stages of change in the past decades in all possible ways. I was wondering whether we can explore a little bit for this section of our conversation the basic rationale underpinning, the basic structure and the basic modalities of the next common agricultural policy. What is driving those changes?
Yes, Petros. Indeed, I think the Commission, as you know, has proposed a new CAP in 2018, and these proposals are still under negotiation between the member states in the Council and the European Parliament. And hopefully, both institutions will reach a political agreement within their institutions in October of this year. So what are the basic elements of these CAP proposals? And I already addressed it a little bit. If you look at the objectives of this common agricultural policy, there are broadly 9 specific objectives on which the common agricultural policy should deliver upon. And you can group these objectives in having a common agricultural policy that is greener, so ecologically more sustainable, that is more sustainable in terms of social and economic issues also, because there is still the question of the fairness of the distribution of funding. You remember that there are discussions that direct payments are granted to large farms. So the Commission has proposed capping at the level of 100,000 euros and a reduction of payments as of 60,000 euros, a solution that was unfortunately not retained at the level of the European Council. But still, I think there is the possibility of voluntary modulation of funding, which still gives member states to the possibility to provide more fairer funding. Finally, I think it's also important that the common agricultural policy contributes to vibrant rural areas, helps to growth and jobs in rural areas. But I think maybe really the key element of the new cut is really related to this effort to make the common agricultural policy greener.
And I think that's a key element here, and that's something we have seen historically, the common agricultural policy moving towards. And I would like to echo what you said with regards to the need for a bit of reform. Now, how will the common agricultural policy contribute to the achievement of those proposals around the farm to fork policy and the biodiversity strategy targets that you have set yourself? Will it function as a vehicle to deliver those targets?
Yes, I think evidently we have not yet the final result of the new CAP, and I can just talk about the proposal that the European Commission has made and which is still subject to discussions with the co-legislators, as I have just pointed out. But let me recall some of these key elements, which I think will be good hooks to integrate the policy objectives of the biodiversity strategy and of the Farm-to-Fork strategy. I think first and foremost, it's important to note that the proposal we have made and that is endorsed by the European Council is that the common agricultural policy, which will have still a quite important budget, as you know, of about 386 billion euros over the next 7 years, has to hugely contribute to the climate objective of the European Commission, which is that the spending under the MFF, the next MFF, should be 30%, and agriculture should contribute 40% of the funding of the common agricultural policy should be dedicated to green and climate-related measures. Secondly, I think there is also a ring fencing in the second pillar, which is the rural development pillar, which is particularly equipped to address climate and environmental issues. There, the Commission has proposed that 30% of this second pillar should be dedicated to environmental, climate, biodiversity-related expenditure. And this 30% should not comprise payments for disadvantaged areas. So again, this would increase the funding for environment and climate also in the second pillar. So this is more the financial framework that will ensure that the common agricultural policy becomes greener. And then we still have specific tools in our proposal that should help us to address the challenges of pesticide reduction, fertilizer reduction, more organic farming, giving agricultural land partially back to nature. And these, as you know, are the main requests or the main objectives of the Farm-to-Fork and the biodiversity strategy. So if I look at this objective, pesticide reduction, fertilizer reduction, more organic, there are quite some hooks in our proposal for the next CAP where we can integrate these requests. We have the so-called good agricultural and environmental conditions that farmer has to respect by definition if they want to get direct payments. And I think we have enhanced this criteria of conditionality in our proposal so that the baseline for receiving direct payments in terms of respecting environmental commitments has been increased. For example, we have a good agricultural and environmental condition that is relating to the protection of biodiversity and to the maintenance of landscape features on agricultural land. And through this GAIEC, we will be able to do this. Secondly, still in the first pillar, where we pay the direct payments, we have proposed so-called eco schemes that again will be able to compensate farmers for more demanding farming practices again related to the issues like pesticide management, fertilizer management, things which are addressed in the Farm-to-Fork strategy. And the same goes for the agri-environmental measures, climate measures in the second pillar, to which I have already referred to. So I think we have the framework, the hooks to take into account these objectives of the Farm-to-Fork strategy. Evidently, this still requires that the co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council, make use of these opportunities and do not water down these proposals from the Commission side.
Indeed, that is always the challenge, I guess. But I've been monopolizing the question so far, and many of our viewers from around Europe want to chip in the conversation. So if you don't mind, I'll bring in a couple of them. Kieran from Ireland, he's actually interested to hear a bit more about the Commission consultation on the long-term vision for rural areas. And his question, he wants to explore your thoughts about how the EU's offshore islands will feature in this long-term vision for rural areas.
Thank you very much for this question. And first and foremost, we are interested by the ideas and positions and good advice from all European citizens. And it's exactly for that purpose that we have launched a public consultation. And I will be very interested to read the contribution of Kieran when it comes to the role of the islands, offshore islands, to which he has referred to. But I think they are part of our rural heritage, and they are in a particular difficult situation because they are quite remote. So I think that is an issue that certainly needs to be addressed in this vision for rural of the future, the long-term vision for rural areas.
Indeed. Then Constance, she's asking, how can we ensure that the crisis recovery funds are used to make EU agriculture greener and more sustainable? Are there any conditions attached to the really ambitious and muscular funding opportunities that are put out there?
Thank you very much. This is indeed also a very pertinent question. And I think at the time we are speaking here now, these points are discussed amongst the member states and the European Parliament. As you rightly point out, additional money will be made available from the new generation EU funds, also for the rural development pillar of the Common Agricultural Policy. And I think that from the side of the Commission, we would really insist that this funding is used in particular and foremost for the greening of the Common Agricultural Policy, and evidently also for recovery related to greening of the Common Agricultural Policy. So I think it's really about making the right use of these additional funds for our farming community.
Indeed. And since we are on the subject of funding, Zoe from Greece, who is also a journalist, wants to ask a little bit how the painful often debates around the next MMF, and considering they seem to feature some cuts on the Common Agricultural Policy, something you touched upon briefly. How can Europe strike a balance between food security and its green ambition when the debate around the next EU budget is featuring so many cuts on Common Agricultural Policy funding?
Again, an issue that is, I think, heavily debated in our circles. The discussion that farmers have to adhere to higher standards, which are more costly, require more resources, and at the same time, so goes the story, the CAP contributions or the CAP budget is reduced. And let me just say a word on the funding of the common agricultural policy. I really think that the common agricultural policy, having regard to the framework conditions in which this decision has been taken, member states, quite some member states being reluctant to contribute to the European budget, new areas of key importance for our societies are rising. Just think in terms of defense, think in terms of digital, think in terms of migration. I really think, from the bottom of my heart, that agriculture has got a good deal in terms of financing of the common agricultural policy. I mean, we cannot ignore that public funds are limited and should serve many important purposes. And I've just listed some of them. This being said, for us it is very clear that if you take current prices, and this is quite frankly what people have in their pocket, it's not constant prices, it's real prices. The expenditure for farming in the next MFF is increasing. If you compare what you have on the 31st of December 2021 compared to what you have in the 31st September in 2021, it will increase. So this does not mean that I do not see the challenge for the farmers with respect to these new tools. But I think we should also not exaggerate, because it is one fact that many of these elements that are foreseen in the common agricultural policy to ensure greening are of a voluntary nature. So this is up to the farmers to take these measures up, and hopefully they take them up. And evidently one condition for the uptake of these measures to reinforce the green nature of the common agricultural policy is that these support measures have adequate funding. And I think they will have this adequate funding.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting indeed. Juan from Spain, I believe, he'll be interested to hear how to assure that the EU food imports that come from other parts of the world respect the environmental rules that EU producers have to implement in the context of the farm-to-fork strategy and biodiversity strategies.
I think this is again an extremely pertinent question, and is one of the main concerns also of the farming community related to Farmtofork and biodiversity strategy. The argument that we have to, or our farmers have to adhere to quite stringent rules that farmers importing to Europe might not need to respect. And I think if you have a careful reading of the Farm-to-Fork strategy, I think European Commission has clearly identified this issue and proposes a two-tier approach to these things. Firstly, I think our intention is to ensure in our bilateral agreements with third countries, including on those that are covering agricultural products, that we have so-called sustainability clauses that ensure that imports from these countries are respecting sustainability criteria. At the same time, I think we will be very vigilant when it comes to trade that is not covered under the bilateral agreements, for example, trade that is covered under the WTO rules, that we use the so-called SPS mechanisms, which is about sanitary, phytosanitary standards relating to animal health, that imported products have to meet the same conditions than our farmers have to meet when they put these products into the markets.
Speaking about the farmers, and one of the questions from one of our viewers, Christian, I believe, is whether there are instruments that can empower farmers. They can give them a bigger say in the decisions that affect them and a fairer share of the income in the food chain. we often see especially smaller producers be squeezed in the process, in the whole chain that brings our food to our table. How can we empower them and give them a more fair share of the income they generate?
I think that again is an extremely pertinent question, and there is no easy reply to it. I think what we have, by the way, really seen in the context of the crisis, of the COVID crisis, is that farmers' organizations have put their efforts together to manage the offer of agricultural products, in particular in the fruit and vegetable sector, but also in other sectors, to keep the prices at the correct level from their point of view. And I think we have accepted these practices, which in other areas of policy making are considered to be, how should I say, to be monitored from the competition point of view. So I think one avenue is really putting the efforts of farmers together in the form of farmers' organizations to have more power when they are dealing with retailers and food processors. And the other thing is that we have done is that the European Union has adopted, I think it was in 2018, we have really adopted new rules that need to be implemented, I think, in this year or the next year, that really give farmers and those who offer farm products to retailers a much stronger role to be treated fairly by retailers. So I think these are just some avenues that should strengthen the role of farmers in the value chain.
Mm-hmm. Thor is asking about the EU's role in contributing towards achieving 25% of ecological agriculture. How can the EU play a role? Who has been quite ambitious in setting targets for environmental policy. How can it play a role in reaching that target too?
I think on the target of reaching 25% of agricultural land in Europe covered by organic farming. I think that's the objective which we would like to achieve by 2030, according to the Farmtofork strategy. And as I have pointed out, I think we have big support measures for organic farming, provide incentive for organic farming, because again, that is voluntary at the level of the farmers. Nobody is forced to become an organic farmer. You need to have an attractive financial framework to become an organic farmer in terms of public support. I think that's an important condition. But this alone will not lead us to the 25%. What makes me optimistic in this respect is really the changing consumer behavior when it comes to accept and buy organic farming, and also accepting higher prices for that. I know that this is not entirely true, because there is a little décalage, if you want, in opinion polls when you ask people whether they are ready to pay more for products that have been produced in a sustainable organic manner. We have a big majority in favor, but often the consumer decisions in the shop are then differently. But I still think that this behavioral change at the level of consumers, and in particular on the young generation, is really taking place. And I think this demand side will be crucial if we want to achieve the 25%. And by the way, just in order to get good ideas how to better promote organic farming, we have also launched a public consultation on how to better promote organic farming.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from a viewer in the Balkans, and as you probably know, the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe have been very affected by the pandemic and food insecurity in general. does the EU have plans to also help countries in the region, both those that are members, but also especially candidate countries from the Western Balkans?
I think for the West Balkan countries, they are already associated to our support program for rural development for pre-accession countries. And I think in that context, we really put a lot of emphasis on making these rural areas and the farmer community future oriented. So I think, yes, we provide support already today to West Balkan countries in the context of our pre-accession aid for rural development.
I'll take one more question. You've been very generous with your time, but I know we're running out of it. It's from Federico in Italy, and it concerns the European Commission work on soil health and food. Federico would like to know which measures will the EU put in place to further ensure protection and preserve EU soil?
I must say all these questions are really so pertinent, because just today we had the Research and Innovation Days here in Brussels, and one key topic on the agenda which I had to moderate was the so-called soil mission, which is exactly about our action, how to improve the quality of soil. Now, if you talk about soil, and I think you would somebody ask in the street, why is this important? I'm not sure that people realize how important healthy soils are for, again, our food security, but also for these other objectives, which are biodiversity, for the carbon sink, carbon sequestration. So healthy soils is hugely important. Healthy soils for healthy lives is the mission that we want to create under the new framework program for research and innovation. And why is it so important? I've just given you the reasons. But the fact is that 70% of our soil here in Europe are not healthy. And this is partly due to farming activities, but not entirely. And it requires action from all across society. It requires action from the land planning responsibles. It requires action from, again, food processors and retailers who need to look under what conditions the products are produced on the farmland. So we have identified this issue, and we are setting up this so-called mission on healthy soil for healthy lives, which has an ambition that within 10 years, the soils are healthy or are healthier, and how to do it through research and innovation, but in particular also through translation of research and innovation in practical terms. We have had here today in this Research and Innovation Day a farmer who closely interacts with research and science and translates this in a living lab, if you so want, on his field. So I'm very optimistic that also with respect to soil health, there is firstly awareness raising, and that we are also addressing this challenge, both in terms of the appropriate funding of measures, but also in terms of research and innovation.
Wolfgang, you've been incredible in responding to a very diverse set of questions with extreme clarity and deep knowledge. It has been very beneficial for all of us listening to this, and we're grateful for your time and contribution to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petrus, and many thanks to the listeners. I really enjoyed. Thank you very much. Bye.
Indeed. Bye. And that's what I would like to echo as well. Thank you very much for taking part in this conversation with your questions and your comments on social media and elsewhere. Our intention is to inform the debate around the big discussions taking place here in Brussels and involve as many people as possible throughout Europe in those decisions that affect them. So we are grateful for the time you took, and we look forward to having you join us again in one of our future discussions. So stay tuned, follow our social media and our website on europeanmovement.eu, and we will be in touch with the next discussion on Talking Europe. In the meantime, have a good afternoon. Thank you.